If you didn't know, this video is actually a part 2 to our review of How High You Go in the Dark. If you would like to see our spoiler-free thoughts on this book, there is actually a part 1 where we talk all about like our opinions overall on the book. This video is actually a really long, in-depth discussion going story by story, telling you all of our thoughts about this book all the way through. I cry twice. So look forward to that. But yes, like I fully appreciate you coming to this video. If you haven't read the book or are unsure that you want to be spoiled, I'm totally fine with you clicking away, going somewhere else. Go watch that spoiler-free review if you haven't already. But if you're here to join the discussion, to listen to us talk about this in detail, if you don't mind spoilers, because again, I think I said it in that last video, I don't think that knowing the plot necessarily is going to detract from the way that this book hits you emotionally. Feel free to sit and listen to us talk about it because we had so many discussions. But really, we would love it if you would join the discussion and comment down below, even if it's just to tell us whether or not you think that you would read this book. Please read this book. Please. We need more people to read this book. Without further ado, though, here's past me and Gretchen talking about this book for about 3 hours. Enjoy. Okay, so clearly we love it and we want you to read it. Now let's talk about this book in detail. Like we said, we initially picked this one up because it was on a list of books that had full cast audios. And
it does technically
it
have a full
does.
cast.
Yes, there's a whole bunch of people that read different stories in here, but it was not full cast in the like radio play type of audiobook. It was full cast in that they found different narrators for every single one of these stories. So we fulfilled the challenge and also didn't quite fulfill the challenge because it wasn't quite what we were expecting. I do feel like the choice of a full cast here was important because I think having one narrator for all of these stories would have impacted the specific nature of the fact that this is meant to be disparate people who are all across the globe, literally, and all across points of time, telling you their stories of how they're interacting with this world, and specifically how they're interacting with, in a main way, death and grief, and what it means to be a human, obviously. If you didn't hear different people talking, I feel like it wouldn't have the same impact. And
I think
maybe
what's
that's a pro for the audiobook, is to say like you kind of get that thing instead of just your own internal monologue.
yeah. I think it's so weird because I was saying to Michaela even before we got on here, I was like, this would be a book that because of all the small details, I would suggest you read. Because even like I was like, I needed Michaela to hunt down some things, in the print book that I couldn't go back and look at very easily in the audiobook. But at the same time, you do have that difference of like, it is such a different, I feel like it feels more human.
Yeah.
It's part of the humanity of it that it is like these individual people. And most of the stories are in the first person. And so when you hear this new person telling this new story, it really does feel like a collection of diary entries or something, that I feel bring you up to the emotionality of it a lot more than just reading a word on the page. So it's almost like you have to do it twice or
Yeah.
at the same time, like Michaela did, because on the one hand, you want to be able to catch those small details and really value the work the author put into this. But at the same time, if you want the emotional gut punch,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know, maybe reading it is a way if you're a little worried about that to like help with that, but I feel like it's such a different experience depending on which way you do it.
And I will say, like, you saw me hold it up. I have an arc of it. I had this before the book came out. I started reading it back then. I didn't finish it. And like I was very forthright with Gretchen with like, I have read these, like I know the plot of them, and I don't think they hit me as much when I was first reading it, and I was just reading it because I obviously with an arc I don't have the audio that's not out yet. There's no way for me to experience that. I just remembered knowing that I didn't want to read this by myself. I needed to talk about it with Gretchen. I wanted to know what Gretchen's point of view of this was. I knew that I liked it. I knew that the writing was very good, and like bits and pieces of these stories were there. I don't know if it was post-COVID brain, because it was like after I had COVID the first time, which I got very sick with. So like maybe that's part of the reason why the first time it didn't like sink into me as much as it did. It may have also just been the proximity to the pandemic, that I was disconnecting from it because of what was going on at the time.
Yeah. I
But
think
it
especially with
was,
that second chapter, like right in the middle of the pandemic, there is no way
yeah.
I would have survived it. I would have been like, Michaela, no.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's hard enough as it is.
Yeah. And even reading it now, we had to put it on pause because of the hurricanes that were hitting the United States, and because of the state of the country with the election that's happening again here in 2024, and what it's like to just freaking live here with people. So like it's not like we are so far removed from this time that it isn't still affecting us. It very much is. But also this book talks about that. It talks about the rippling out effects of events like this, and how different people respond to it. It's like very much what the book is talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
So, do we want to start? I mean, so I gave kind of like the plot of the first story.
Yes.
The first chapter is called 30,000 Years Beneath a Eulogy. And so I kind of gave you the overview of what that was. Cliff goes out to the Arctic to be close to his daughter. I remember, I feel like this book really, or this chapter really well encapsulates the reading experience that you are about to have. I feel like at one point I texted Michaela and I was like, why do I need to feel so sad for this man when this book is just getting the plague, or this chapter is just getting the plague started? Because I was so mad. I
Mm,
was so invested in this father daughter relationship where the daughter is already dead.
yep.
And knowing that the background of this whole chapter is that this mummified, iced, like, ancient human body that they found is going to release the plague upon the world. And that everybody at that Arctic station is going to die.
Yeah, the
Um,
blurb of the book tells you that the pandemic is going to happen. So while the characters don't quite know yet that that's about to happen, they sort of make a joke about it offhandedly at one point, like, "Ah, what if something happens?" And then it does, and you as a reader are like, "It, oh yeah, no, it's
yeah,
gonna
yeah,
happen."
yeah, it's literally the book. Thank you.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, even though we said this is a spoiler section, that's not technically a spoiler. Like, you as the reader, like, you can hear the Jaws music in the distance, right? Like, this
Yes.
shark be coming.
Yeah.
Um, so I feel like it that encapsulates the book because you do get so attached to these characters so quickly and so heart-wrenchingly. And then it's also sad because you know that you have to leave them. I mean, in this case, Cliff will die.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, and his daughter is already dead. But yeah, I was just like anger texting Michaela, like, they couldn't have just started the plague. Why you hurt me like this? And then the second chapter showed up. But anyway, what are your thoughts on the first chapter?
I feel like, and keep in mind, folks, that we read this one months ago at this like this is probably literally like the farthest out that we can be from one of these chapters. But I feel like for me, because I knew that the plague was already coming, I didn't have quite as much of an emotional response to the first chapter as you did. I definitely did to the second chapter. We both had this, I think, the same
Okay, do
emotional
we just want to
response.
talk about the second
We
chapter? Because
can
like
let me finish talking about this
okay.
because we're going to move on to that. I did not have quite as much of an emotional response to the first chapter. I think because when I know something bad is coming, I pull myself back a little bit from it. So while I recognize that it was sad, and it definitely was sad, like you're reading this man's diary entries, both to his wife and grandchild back home, and also like some of them are directed to his dead daughter, like him like talking to her and trying to be as close to her as possible. It is very much sort of like the capstone on this, of saying this is a book where we are going to try and explore every single facet that a person feels about trying to connect with people that are no longer there. And any way that you can. Like that is what this is. Like he's desperately trying to grasp any little piece of his daughter that he can while continuing her work because he believed that what she did was important, to the point where, unfortunately for him, it also means that he follows in her footsteps. And he's leaving people behind who would then have to grieve him and
Yeah.
go on with their lives in other ways too.
Well, and I think it's like disconnection and also just like the many facets of grief
Yeah.
and what it looks like to grieve, because grief is one word with many faces.
Yes.
Um, and all of the chapters are exploring like one little slice
Yes.
of that.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, the second one is like I it is what I would consider the 6 out of 5 star chapter, and it is unfortunate for the rest of the book because I don't think that any chapter after that hits the exact same emotional points that the second chapter does
No.
again. It's not
I
that those
mean,
are
in a
bad,
way,
but it
thank God.
doesn't. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, it's definitely the hardest one to read, and it is unfortunate that it is right there for that point because a lot of people are like, I can't do this, and they're not going to continue reading the book. It also is unfortunate for the other chapters because none of them are ever going to live up to the same emotional poignancy that this chapter does. Um, and I like that's okay because I don't think that I could read a whole book that did this.
No.
Like,
So, for everybody who has not read this book,
oh yeah,
the second chapter is called City of Laughter. And the main character is a dude named Skip. And Skip was trying to make it as a stand up comedian. And it wasn't really working because the Arctic plague was washing over the entire globe. Not really a funny haha time. So
he didn't have the chops of Bo Burnham.
yeah, the heart-wrenching thing about the first wave of the Arctic plague is that it only attacks children.
Yep.
And so adults are generally fine. It will eventually later on spread to adults, but in this first wave, it is only infecting children. And what happens is that it infects children and it basically starts to transmogrify their organs. Like suddenly your lung is like a kidney, right? And so like your brain becomes a spleen. And so like it literally just starts to like not just like destroy you from the inside, but like just completely warp your entire body. So it's quite a violent situation and painful,
Mm-hmm.
right? Especially in small bodies, but also then painful for adults watching this happen to small children.
Yep.
Um, and at this point, there's no cure. There are tons of possible experimental treatments, but there's no cure. So Skip goes to work at one of these businesses that is an outgrowth of the plague, because one of the through lines through this book is like death capitalism,
Yep.
and like how businesses make money off of dying people and people who are left behind to grieve the dying people.
Yep.
So he goes to work at the City of Laughter, which is a euthanasia amusement park for children. So it's a place where families bring their small children when they know that there is no more hope for them. And they have one last perfect day as a family at this amusement park. And then there's this final roller coaster ride that uses like chemicals and G forces essentially to lull the children to sleep and euthanize them, essentially.
More
Skip falls.
humanely than the slow death of like your lung turning into a heart all of a sudden.
Yeah, so Skip falls in love with a mother who is there. Her name is Dory. She has brought her small son in the hope that there's some experimental treatments going on. They develop a very, very close relationship, but in the end, the small child cannot be saved. And neither can their relationship.
Yep.
Anyway, I will have nightmares about this for the rest of my life. Thanks, Michaela.
Sorry, man. Here's the thing. It is looking at probably the darkest side of death. Like most humans will agree that death of a child is the worst thing that anybody can experience. death in any capacity sucks, but like when your grandparent dies, that's expected, right? Like they're old, they've lived their life. But when a child who never gets to live, who doesn't get to experience things dies, that is like maybe the saddest thing that anybody can ever experience. And you are following these people who I'm gonna fucking cry talking about this. You're following these people who have to make the decision to essentially kill their child, which is so bad.
And you also like, I mean, you get Skip, who it's this the cognitive dissonance is like, and not cognitive, but it's intentional, right?
Yeah.
Of like Skip is like dancing around in a mouse costume, like making children laugh, but
Yeah.
also like when there are families that bring their children and then they have like a take backseat moment where they're like, Jesus, I cannot go through with this. And then it's his job to like go after them in the mouse costume. There's like a
Yeah,
scene where
he's
this
like an
happens.
enforcer. Like he has to force these people. They've made the decision to come through the doors. They aren't allowed to leave at this point
Yeah.
until their child is dead. So like once you get there, that's it. Like you can't leave. And like he has to try and make it funny, haha, while also being like a bouncer. Like you can't leave. You have to go through with this at this point.
Yeah. And you see that moment of like, of Skip, who is there at first and he is doing his damnedest to like keep himself as a remove and like think about, okay, this is a humane thing to do. It is the right thing to like, I'm here to do the best that I can. And then he meets Dory and he develops a deep friendship with, his name is Fitch, right?
I think so, yeah.
Who really wants to be an astronaut. Um, and it just all of a sudden, like you just watch like him break down too, and he just like all of a sudden this becomes real to him.
Yep.
And you have to go on that journey with him
Yep.
until he eventually sends Fitch on the roller coaster.
Again, we've read this chapter months ago. Just me trying to talk about it, I was starting to cry again. So, like, we cannot underpin how emotionally devastating this one story is. Like, literally, this one story. You can't unread it, and it's brilliant in a lot of ways and so devastating. Um, especially coming from a person who, like, when you think about the minutia of it, this is a person who's a comedian, right? Like the thing that he wants is to make people laugh. He wants to bring joy to people, and it has been twisted and corrupted into, like, he feels validated and tries to reassure his family, like, yes, he's doing good, he's making these children laugh, he's giving them this one happy memory. They're gonna die anyway. There's nothing else, that he can't save them. He knows he can't save them, but this is what I can give. I can give joy in this darkness as much as I can. And it doesn't matter. Like the
Yeah.
he can get, he it like slowly kills him inside to do this, in the same way that like trying to hold joy in the face of despair is near impossible. Anyway, 6 out of 5 stars. City of Laughter.
It's yeah, and this is the chapter where it's just like, I mean, I can't blame a lot of people if they don't move on past that chapter. I will say that if you can get past that chapter, nothing is ever quite so bad after.
No, yeah, it definitely is not as gut-wrenching. I feel like it definitely gets easier the farther into the book that you get.
I feel like
Um,
this is a really good time to tell you that there are a lot of angry Goodreads reviews that say that this book has too much positivity. Um, there will be some positive things, sure, but like just after like Michaela's crying on video, and those are the reviews. I just to let you know like where we're going. This book contained multitudes, okay?
yeah.
But I think a
Yeah.
really good example of that, and I think how this book pairs stories really well, is that the next story, the next chapter, I don't really know how I'm going to use those words interchangeably, it doesn't matter,
Yeah.
is called Through the Garden of Memory. And at this point, you learn that the um, that adults can be infected. And so the main character of this, his name is June, gets infected with the disease. And what happens to adults who get this disease is that they fall into a coma.
Yeah.
Um, and so there's a whole thing with like his family in the beginning there, and then he falls into this coma, and he ends up in this dream shadow
Void.
land
Yeah.
void
Yeah.
area, where he can hear other people. He can't necessarily see them, but he can hear them. And there's like, it ends up, I think it's like, you can't really tell if there's like tens, dozens, hundreds. Like it's just like this kind of like amorphous void soul
You
zone.
you get the feeling that the longer they're in the void, more and more people keep showing up. So like it may start with just a couple, but by the end of the story, there's probably hundreds of, if not
Yes.
thousands of people showing up here.
And you learn that these are all people who have adults who have gotten the plague and then fallen into a coma. And like for somehow they're all ending up in this void space. And this incredible thing happens where they are able to like see memories, and not only see their own memories, but they're like these little bubbles, and you can walk into someone else's memory and learn intensely personal things about these strangers
Yep.
that are around you. And the culminating action of this chapter is that they realize that there's all these adults and one baby. And these hundreds of strangers who've just had this intense bonding experience come together to say, we need to try to save this baby. We don't know if our actions are actually going to save the baby, but we think that there's like a ceiling or something to this void space. And if all of the hundreds of us make a cheerleader pyramid, June gets to the top and they fling the baby out of the
There's
void.
like a Stranger Things upside down reverse gravity point at the
Yeah.
top that they find very early on, but it's not strong enough to pull a whole human, but it is strong enough to lift a baby. And yeah, this story is very much at the heart of like every time you see disaster movies, disaster stories, the whole point at the end is like save the child. And like this is very much that, you know, like if we're all trapped here in this void, we can't do anything. We can experience each other's memories, but even that at one point kind of fades away and they can't do that anymore. And they're just left with this baby. Everybody unanimously says try and save the baby. If we can't get out of the void, save the baby, toss the baby into space, and hope and pray that that means that the baby is safe
Yeah.
because they don't actually know.
Yeah.
There's no
And
way
it's like
to know.
they do argue. There is
Yeah,
certainly like a, is this useful? Is this, but they eventually, like, nobody says, like, no, you should save me, right?
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
it is like they come to this, like, unanimous consensus of humanity to try to save this child. And I think that it's especially poignant coming on the heels of City of Laughter, where you know that, like, in the real world, like, children are dying.
yeah.
And they're still coming together, and they're just like, if we can all work together to try to save this one child, to get them out of here, it's worth the attempt. And then they work together to do that, not knowing if it's going to work. I mean, if you think about like this pyramids of hundreds of people, there are people shouting like, I'm suffocating. So it
Yeah.
like can't be great.
No.
But it's like genuinely just like a huge chunk of humanity saying this one chance, we're gonna give it. Um, so it is, I feel like it's meant to be a lightener after
Yeah,
City of Laughter.
yeah,
Um, and it also, I think at this point you start to get the trickling of sci-fi elements, shall we say, or at least like,
yes.
it's a little alternate reality.
It's
Like,
more speculative than the
yeah,
previous two
thank you.
chapters are. The previous two chapters are very grounded in reality. They're very grounded in like what actually would happen to people. And this is the first time where you get sort of like a imagining of like what this plague could do that isn't just the physical reality of what it is. There is like a metaphysical thing that is also happening with this plague. I do find it incredibly interesting that what the plague does is connect people. It literally makes them all experience each other in a way that is physically impossible in reality. Um, Even somebody telling you a story of their memory is not the same as like physically standing inside of somebody's memory and experiencing it with them, which is
Mhm.
sort of what happens here. Um, you get to know another person on a level that no one else is ever going to do, or be able to. And there are stories later that revisit this and sort of what the reaction to having experienced that is that I found incredibly touching personally. So like while we were reading this, I read this one story and I was like, that was kind of weird and like meh. And like especially
Yeah.
on the backs of one that was like very emotionally poignant. There is like no real deep core in this story. It feels kind of like surface level when
Yeah.
compared to the previous two stories. But it does come back and it does reinforce and create interesting ripples throughout the rest of the book
Yeah.
because of this one. So, and that's the thing. That's why I say like even though like this story like if it I had read it on its own would have been like maybe a 3-star story. It's like that was kind of weird. Okay, continuing. Um because of the way that it interacts with the rest of the book and the way that the ramifications of this chapter are reintroduced and re-explored later, it adds more value and makes that 3-star story seem more than it is.
Yeah.
Um,
I think for me, I think the problem was that the stories that it's sandwiched in between are
yes,
so much more interesting. And we're going to talk about the next story
yes,
because that's when you just start to go like, what is happening? Um, but I think for me, it did take a little long for this story to have meaning.
yeah,
I kind of, and I mean, obviously the people who are in comas and they're not going to wake up until there's a like a cure for the plague or whatever.
yep,
But like, and I'm sure part of it had to do with how long it took us to read it. But I had almost like because City of Laughter and the chapter that come after it, which is called Pig Son, put a pin in that, are like so good. I genuinely think I had like deleted memory of this story
yeah.
until like it did finally come back around again. And I was like, what are they talking about? Oh, yeah. Remember the cheerleader pyramid where they flung a baby into the sky? That's right. So I will say that, like, I don't know, maybe this should have come a little later, maybe to like
Maybe.
help it connect a little bit more. But at the same time, I feel like it was where it was because Pig Son's not exactly happy either.
Yeah.
So there was
Um,
some understanding of like this maybe needs to go here for like a break.
we alluded to it briefly. My copy of the arc, the very first page is a letter from the author talking about the experience of writing this book, and I don't know if that's in the finalized published physical copy, but I know it's
It
not
was
in the
not read
audio
in the
book.
audiobook.
Yeah, so what it did tell us was that it took 10 years to write this book and 3 years to edit it, which from what I understand is insane. 3 years of editing is kind of wild for books, especially nowadays. Like I feel like we talk about it a lot where we're like, this book needed more editing. Why
Yeah.
didn't it get more edit? This one got the editing it needed. And I feel like perhaps something like this, like where these stories should go in sequence, may have been like part of the reason it took so long to edit it was like, where would this have the most emotional impact? Do we need this moment of levity after something like City of Laughter? And I do think you need it. Like
You I'm
I
not yeah.
I think it is like I don't think
There
that
is
it would
no
be.
other story that would go there. But
Yeah,
I think that's where you get in this book this tension that I'm not sure is ever 100% resolved
yeah,
between the literary and the emotion,
yeah,
right? Where sometimes in order to like have a more connective story because it is individual short stories, maybe these two should have been closer together, but
yeah.
like you needed that emotional pause,
Here,
there.
yeah.
So like I understand where it is, but I think that's a
That's
tension
the
in this book.
struggle. Yeah,
Yeah.
and
But
and
anyway,
again, like our experience of reading this is 3 months long. Some of these times we put the book down and picked it back up after reading this one. And Gretchen and I picked them up at different points too. I think I stopped after this one and then I picked up Pig Son when we were rereading it again later on. But you had read farther along than me at the earlier point when we were reading this. So
Yes,
um
I took a break
yeah,
after City of Laughter. Like I needed,
yeah,
you know, and then I think I did read through because the Garden of Memory one, I was like, this is what comes after City of Laughter,
yeah.
and then we get Pig Son.
Yes. Okay, so let's talk about Pig Son because
Yeah.
it is interesting.
So Pig Son is again is where you start to see, because Cliff's story, Skip's story, and June's story are not connected,
No.
and except for they're all like phases of this plague, right? Where you're seeing the progression.
I think
Pig Son,
Skip shows up briefly in Garden of Memory. He's one of the people, you might not remember this because of how long ago you read it. He is one of the people who's looking at a memory and he's looking at a memory of the mother and son that he became attached with. And
oh, that's right, I do
he
remember that.
briefly says something along the lines of she's there by herself now. Like something like really small. It's just one line, like one moment
Yeah.
in that whole story, but he does reappear there. That I think is the
Okay.
first time we actually see a reappearance.
A momentary reappearance there.
Yes.
It's the Pig Son is the first time that a character related to a previous character like leads a chapter.
Yes.
Um, so the narrator of Pig Son is Fitch's dad.
Yep.
So what you learn from In City of Laughter is that Dory has basically separated from her husband. He is a scientist trying to find a cure for the plague, and it is his money and his connections that has kept Fitch alive as long as he has been. But they have kind of separated due to some like differences of opinion about like this whole process. And so by this point, I believe his name is David. In my head, he's just Fitch's dad. Has learned that his son has been euthanized. Um, and so he's like dealing with that grief that he couldn't save him, that he really didn't have a say in this decision. He just learned that it had happened. Um, and so there's like dual grief and guilt and sadness and loss. And so one of the things that they started to do is they need transplant organs for these children because again, their organs are transmogrifying into other things. So they need the actual organ to replace the thing that gets messed up. And one of the ways they started doing that is using pig organs,
Genetically modified pig
genetically
organs.
modified pig organs. Um, some of the genetic modification in his lab goes a little too far. And one of the pigs in his lab starts to learn how to speak. And here you get Pig Son, because essentially what happens is that, Fitch's dad starts to use like, he's teaching another being to speak and to live and what?
I would like to note that it was very funny and it made me laugh out loud that this pig's name is Snortorius Pig.
Yes!
Just A plus A plus naming of this pig. It was very
Notorious.
funny. Good.
And what's great when you're listening to the audiobook is it's like this very sad man reading it and he's like, and then Notorious said, and I'm just like, it's very hard to take parts of it seriously. Thank you for
Yeah.
bringing that up.
Yes.
Um, but so like yeah, he becomes very emotionally attached to this pig. But obviously once the government realizes that they've like got a talking pig, it like becomes a whole thing, and then they realize that they've potentially set up, Snortorius to become a lab rat. And Snotorius wants to know because he learns that like these scientists are trying to save the world, and he watches TV and he sees the horror of the plague and all this type of stuff. And he wants to know what his purpose is and how, he's meant to help. And they tell him that, he was supposed to be killed for the organs. Or he has to now be shipped off to Area 51 where they, are going to analyze him for being a talking pig and like rip his brain open.
Yep.
And so Notorious does not want that to happen to him, and he wants to help his family, essentially, the only family he's ever known, and he wants to be like them and try to save the world and have his purpose. And he realizes that his purpose is to die and have his organs used to save, or at least temporarily save, a child. And so it's,
Yeah.
for it being a ridiculous premise,
Yes.
is an incredibly sad chapter.
Honestly, like when you talk about like it's like haha funny, they have this pig and he's thinking it is done with so much care.
I know.
I was talking about it with Isaac and I was like the pig asks like what's my job? Like what am I supposed to do? And the scientist shows him one that pigs initially were food, which freaks the pig out as it should. Like pig is food? What? Two says yes, some pigs were food, but then also your job in particular. This is, you know, I have a heart, you have a heart, you know, your heart can be taken and put into a person to help save them. And he says, but pig die without heart. And it's like, yes, you would die without the heart. And they continue on for a little while. The thing that Gretchen didn't mention here is that they also learn that the mutation in his brain is creating his brain to continue to grow
Oh,
and
yeah,
that he
sorry.
will die regardless of whether or not he goes to be studied by the folks in the government, because his brain at some point will be so large it's literally going to like crush
It's
itself
killing him,
inside of
yeah.
his skull. So the pig knows, A, I'm dying. B, I'll be taken away from my family. C, they're doing so much work to try and save people and I respect them and want to be like them. I'm going to make the choice to die in this moment to give my organs to someone who can maybe save them, because that was the ultimate goal for me before all of this anyway. But B, I'm seeing these people. And I was talking about this with Isaac, and Isaac said, I appreciate that the scientists were honest with the pig. And I was like,
Mhm.
I also appreciate that, because more often than not, especially when it comes to parents talking with children, there is this want to protect them from the negative aspects of the world. And I feel like that does a disservice to a lot of people, and especially with a father who is really struggling with the fact that he was not around for his son's death, one, but two, for quite a while before his son's
Yeah.
death, because he was focusing so hard on saving his son through his science that he wasn't there when it was happening.
Yeah.
Um, he's taking this second chance to try and be there for a surrogate son in the pig son, nominally, um, to actually like hold the pig's hand essentially through this thing
Yeah.
of like, I'm sorry, I can't save you. Like, no matter how much I want to, I can't save you.
And it pairs so, I mean, first of all, I mean, because like so much of this book is asking, like, what is humanity?
Yeah.
Right. And here you have like this pig who has just learned about the world, right? And has decided that basic goodness, decency, humanity is that my life should not continue, that so that someone else, you know, so that someone else's can, but also that he chooses how he dies, which is in direct contrast really to the City of Laughter, where for the most part, I mean, some of the kids you do know are aware of what is
Yeah,
going to
they
happen to
they
them on
make
that.
mention that they know, but not all
Yeah.
of them do.
But like not all of them know, right? And so here is this essentially child, pig child, pig son who gets to make that decision for themselves. Because another theme in this book is what is death?
Yeah.
And how do we deal with death and what does it mean to die? Um, and so yeah, it's like I remember starting it and like I just saw the title. Well, I heard the title and I went, it's just like this is, I really genuinely think I thought that this is where the book was going to go off the rails, because I was like, this is just so, because again, we've had the really sad father daughter, we've had City of Laughter, and then we've had the bonkers fling the baby into the sun cheerleading pyramid.
Yeah.
And then pick, and I was like, ugh,
The conceit's hard. It's a hard conceit to
yeah.
swallow, yeah.
And I think that if you hadn't had the solid foundation of those previous chapters, you probably wouldn't do it. But I was like, well, I'm in this deep. And then it's like you said, it's almost so much care. You're like, I don't know how that worked, but it
Yeah,
really did.
it did 100%. And then we get Elegy Hotel.
So Elegy Hotel is hard because I was very interested in the concept. I had a lot of difficulty with the story.
Yeah.
So
I also
Elegy,
feel like this one was a weaker one out of all of the
yeah,
stories.
yeah. So Elegy Hotel is about Dennis, who works as a bereavement coordinator at an Elegy Hotel. And this is essentially a hotel where people go to die or families go to like visit their loved ones before the bodies are cremated. So it literally is just like a death hotel. And Dennis is like, oh, this is really great. I get to like help people in their time of need. I feel useful. But then his brother is like, hey, by the way, our mom is dying. And Dennis is like, I'm not gonna come home, like I'm needed here. And so, he has the disconnect of like helping these other people through a difficult time, but like he's not able to emotionally connect with the needs of his brother and his mother. And he keeps saying, like, oh, I'll call her, like, oh, I'll do it. And then by the time he finally really gets up the gumption to do anything, his mother has passed. And he feels like he like goes overboard using all of like his credits and like basically putting himself in indentured servitude to give her space at the Elegy Hotel.
It is also, I think, the first one that sort of talks about the death cryptocurrency that gets
Yes,
created.
yes. Okay, so this is why like I found all the little details of death capitalism in this one
Yep.
really interesting because I mean the whole way again that we talked about that like the world is trying to like survive this plague, and of course capitalism is like how can we take people's money and like monetize their grief.
Yeah.
This is not the only time it will show up, but it's like the first one that really delves into it because by this point it's there's like a whole industry now that is doing this death cryptocurrency, the bereavement hotels. More and more weird things will start to crop up.
Yeah.
But yeah, the story itself was like everybody telling Dennis he's an asshole, and Dennis telling himself he's an asshole,
Yep.
and then he's just an asshole.
I do feel like as much as Dennis is an asshole, I 100% can relate to Dennis as a person.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
I very much have an avoidance of my family, especially when there's like difficult relationships, and we learn that he feels like he can't live up to what his parents want. He's never going to be good enough.
His
He feels
brother, by the
yeah.
way, is like a super, super lauded like scientist.
Yes.
Like he's like famous and
Yes.
super like well known, you know. So obviously Dennis is like he's barely made like passing grades, right? And so he's not
Yes. He's
he feels
he's
less than and has
he
been
feels less.
told that he
Yes.
was less than.
It's a reaction to the way that his parents treated him growing up, as well as like a compounding effect of like a personal guilt. Like he's punishing himself. Like he wants to love his mom and be loved back, but he can't escape from this guilt of like, well, she doesn't actually love me. She loves her other son. She doesn't actually
Well,
want me.
and I mean, wasn't
I've
this also
hurt
the
her.
story that like he got physical with his dad
Yes.
and he was kicked out of the house and he
Yes.
never saw his dad again before his dad died?
Yes.
So it's a little bit of like that. There's like a guilt, like you said, he's punishing himself. That's the punishment is like,
Yeah, I'm not allowed to have this closure, because if I do, then like what was the point of all of this pain previously? And I think a lot of people will relate to that as much
yes.
as like the story itself is kind of a nothing story. Like it's very
Yeah.
introspective on his part.
I think this is one of the stories where um I 100% get it.
Yep.
I understood it,
Yep.
and I was like, eh.
Yeah.
Like, you know, again, it's that point of like, and I understand why the story is there, but I was just like, as a reader, I was like, to me, this is a bit of a nothing burger. Like,
Yes.
100% totally get it, totally get it, totally understand it, totally see what you're trying to say to me. It's a good point. But like, I just read a story about a pig.
I feel like with a lot of these, there are stories that are holding up mirrors, right? Like look at yourself, like look at how you interact with it. There is going to be some person who reads the story and it is the most meaningful story to them
Yeah.
personally. And I can acknowledge that and respect that. That for me and for you, this was kind of meh and didn't really do a lot. We can see what it's doing and we understand and we think it did it like properly, but for us this doesn't have any sort of real, it doesn't stick.
Yeah.
I'm sure there is someone who will read this book and read this story, and it will be the most poignant and impactful
Yeah.
for them.
Well, and that's when you go back to grief has many faces.
Yeah.
And this is not one that we are familiar with or that really like personally resonates with us necessarily, except like we see like a shadow of resonance, but it's not.
Yes.
And I think that's why, again, we go back to read this with a group of people because you will find, I imagine, someone for whom each chapter resonates, and you can maybe understand them a little bit better. But at the very least, death cryptocurrency, death capitalism, like
Yep.
a lot of small details in this book that really make you question humanity.
Yeah. Yeah. And what sucks is that it as like unrealistic as like those words sounded, it is grounded in reality.
Oh yeah, that's
We
exactly.
know
Oh,
that this
hundred
would
percent,
happen. 100%.
100%.
Don't mind the lighting change, folks. Like we said, we've been talking about this book for literal hours and we're going to continue to talk about it. And this
Uh,
video is going to be crazy long.
this like the book. It's a marathon. Okay,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
this is a
It's good.
marathon, not a sprint.
Yep.
And now we have to talk about robot dogs.
Robot dogs. uh,
So the next chapter is called "Speak, Fetch, Say I Love You," and so again, like this, the book is set in like a slightly future space,
yeah.
right? So just to be clear, so in this one, it is about the main character is a father who has a young, like preteen son. I think is about how old he is, um, or like upper young child,
Yeah.
and they have recently lost Ayano, who was his wife, his son's mother, to I think it was just cancer.
Yes.
And
I
I
think it
say
was a
just cancer, but like it was a disease that previously existed and was not like the plague. And that's important because, you know, she was ill for a long time. She was in the hospital for a long time. And it was a different sort of death than the
it
death.
also speaks to like other diseases still exist. Like just because there's
Yes.
this Arctic plague that's happening doesn't mean that people aren't still dying of heart attacks and cancer. Like that also is still happening in this world.
Yeah. So, one of in a slightly more previous time, one of the toys or companions of choice was robo-dogs. And so these were very sophisticated robotic dogs that, you know, could learn commands, but also like, I mean, some of them could like literally speak, some of them. Um, but as the Arctic plague set in, these became something that stopped being produced. And so the main character of this story, his entire job used to be getting replacement parts and fixing people's robo dogs. And he's still trying to do that. However, the parts are no longer being produced. And so it's becoming more and more impossible. And so these families that are already losing, you know, human loved ones are losing these pets that, for all intents and purposes, they feel as strongly connected to as if it was like a you know, a real live dog. And the father and his son, they have a robo dog named Hollywood, And one thing that Ayano did before she died was there was a recording that she like had the dog record of her singing and also her saying, "I love you." And so there's a deep emotional attachment between his son and the dog, Hollywood. But Hollywood is beginning to malfunction. And so, you know, even though the father has captured those recordings on like a USB or like on a drive or whatever they call it in that time, um, the son is losing this last like thing that his mother loved, and that says, you know, "I love you" with his mother's voice. Um, yeah, there's like multiple layers in the story that we've talked
Yes.
about, but I think we also agree that again, it's not one of the stronger ones.
Correct. Yeah. This isn't as like emotionally resonant as I feel like some of the other ones are, like on like a affecting you physically way, but I do feel like this is one of the ones that is like some of the most interesting things to pick apart the layers of what it is actually talking about. I talked about this one a lot with my partner Isaac as well, where I was like the when I was in high school, let me back up. When I was in high school, I went to a leadership conference where I did a bunch of stuff. And one of the courses that I took at the leadership conference was talking about um, planned obsolescence in technology and the field specifically, because it is something that we are seeing more and more at the time. Like this is like 2009. So it was before a lot of the big tech booms that we've seen now, but it was becoming more common practice where in the past you would get your lawnmower and it would have all the same washers. You could go to the hardware store and replace the washer and fix your lawnmower, and your lawnmower would last for 100 years because you could always get the washer. It didn't matter. And then slowly companies have made all of their things proprietary. So now you can only buy the washer that belongs to the Ryobi lawnmower. Like it's not all lawnmowers, it's just Ryobi's thing. And then it became, when it's like an Apple thing, actually we're going to change the charge port. So now not only do we no longer make this iPhone anymore, we don't even make the charger anymore. So if the iPhone still works, the charger no longer doesn't, and you can't even get a new charger. So these dogs are representative of this concept of planned obsolescence. It's partially that company doesn't exist anymore because the plague happened and now nobody wants to buy robot dogs. They're too busy trying to save their loved ones and spending their money on that or just surviving. And it's also partially of like these models, you need to get a very specific part anyway. You can't just take anything from anywhere. You need this specific company's this specific part for this specific model. And then it adds the extra layer of, for a lot of people, the reason they're so attached to these dogs, it's not just that it's a pet, because it is a pet and you already have an emotional attachment to something that like you play with and care about. But a lot of them have recordings on them from the people who have died of the plague or other reasons. And while he can replace the motherboard by taking one out of another dog that he has that broke its leg, and that one doesn't work, but the motherboard's still fine. But if he does that, it is going to erase the recordings. This motherboard doesn't have the recordings from the people who own the dog are actually attached to. So now you still have the object. The dog will work. It will bark. It will do what the dog normally did, but it no longer has what he considers the soul of the animal in it anymore. Because what you're actually attached to is this very last thing that the person you loved touched, the last thing they said that you can replay and listen to. So you have this weird delayed second death of the people you have already lost. You're holding on to these bits and pieces of them that in an object that is deteriorating as well. And then you have the extra layer on top of that, in that the man who repairs these dogs can't even repair his own dog. And it's the only thing that he and his son are able to connect over at all. They do not talk, they do not eat meals together, they don't spend time together unless they are both listening to the dog sing with his dead wife's voice while his son plays an instrument. That's the
Yeah.
only time he is able to connect. I'm blurry. That's the only time he is able to connect with his son on an emotional level. And he can't fix it. And that's represented in the fact that he can't fix the dog.
Well, and I think there's like, and one of the other things that it's like trying to do too, I think, is like talk about like when do you let go? Like
Yeah.
when do you let something die? Because there's this whole thing about his son telling him that he needs to stop giving people, like he needs to take down his website because he's giving people this hope that he can fix their dogs when like
Yeah.
he really knows that he really can't.
Yeah.
And so his son is like, you've got to let go. You've got to like, do something different. You've got to do that. And then, his son is not moving on past his dog,
Yeah.
right? And he's like, so there's also like that. I think it's trying to do a lot of things and it only does some of them partially.
Yeah.
Um, so that's I think part of the problem, but
I feel like all of the things that this one story is, this is maybe the only one where I feel like a full novel would have given that all of the things this one story is trying to do justice.
yeah.
Not that I would think it would be interesting necessarily to read a whole novel of just this story or that it takes away from like the other things that are going on in these collection of stories, but there are so many layers to this one story and because there are so many layers, it doesn't have the space to do them all justice like you said.
Yeah.
Um but again, do we want to read a whole book about this? Probably not.
No.
Probably not.
No.
So,
The
while
answer is
it
no.
may have been more successful, it was longer. Do we actually want to have a longer story there? Probably not. But yeah, it was definitely one of the ones that like the more I looked at it and the more that I like picked away pieces of it, the like more that I actually liked the story. And I felt like it was very interesting. And it was holding up different mirrors. While it is about the grief still, I feel like it was also, and we've been talking about the capitalism elements that are
Yeah.
throughout this. It was definitely like putting focuses on other things, putting
Yeah.
focuses on the way that humans become attached to objects and not just people, and also the way that sometimes your connection to the object is stronger than your connection to people, which is interesting too. Like it very much is like this is a weird quirk that humanity has. We look at a bunch of circuits that looks like a dog, which you could have an alive dog that like actually does stuff, and you care about it in the exact same way that you would with an alive
Yeah,
dog.
I was like, okay, so like I know I just said no novel, but I was like, how did this happen? Like, do people just not have dogs anymore? Did all the dogs go like where?
It can't
Because
get
I don't think
sick.
anyone
You
in
don't have to
this
pick up poop. Like some
I
people, especially because I think this one is specifically is set in Japan. I think
yeah,
that especially for Japan, where there's like fewer and fewer public spaces, like where are you going to go out and walk your dog in
I'm
Tokyo?
just saying that no one in this novel had a pet. Where did the pets go?
Fair
Do I need
enough.
to protect my cat? Anyway, so want to move on?
Fair enough. Yeah. Yeah. Songs
Um,
of Your Decay is next, correct?
yes. So this is one of the ones where I like had a weird parallel moment running because one of my favorite episodes of the TV show Bones, which is about a forensic anthropologist, is an episode where they find an actual like murder victim at a body farm.
Yeah.
This the story takes place at a
That's a
body
great
farm.
place to hide a body, by the
It,
way.
it, it is. It's a great. I'm actually surprised that it took them that many seasons to have that storyline.
Yeah.
But that's a very funny like Bones running around the body farm. She is just the happiest she has ever been in her entire life. This is not a happy story, but it does take place at a body farm. So immediately my brain was like, uh-oh, oh. But anyway, this is the story of Audrey. She used to be before the pandemic. She is a pathologist and she would help um, the law enforcement solve crimes. It was one of her main jobs. And now she is also like helping other criminal pathologist students, but she is also trying to help find a cure for the plague by studying the plague after people have died from it and like
Yeah.
what happens to those bodies when they die. She is married to an EMT, and she has formed a connection with a gentleman named Laird. It is revealed mid-story that they were friends before he contracted the plague. I kind of wish that that had not been the case, but whatever. Um, but basically, once his mother had died, and he was searching for purpose, and that's how he found Audrey's lab, and he wanted to help them, like, help give justice and hope to the world. And then he ended up also contracting the plague. And so his way to give meaning to his life is to donate his body to Audrey and the body farm so that he can be used for study after he's gone. Audrey has developed a closeness with him. They are going through an iPod, letter by letter, and there's a whole lot of different music that is used throughout the story. Um, References you may or may not get depending on if you know the lyrics to the songs,
Right.
which I think makes it more effective if you do, less effective if you don't. I did not know most of them.
I knew most of them. It is a lot of like classic music. So if you're not a person that listens to like classic rock or like older styles of music, like if you're like very set in like a specific genre, you're not going to get all of the there was like actually a pretty widespread of genre music
Well, I was
too.
gonna say it wasn't all classic because I like did it. I had a heavy classic rock phase, and that's why I knew some of them, but some of them were quite different. But anyway,
Yeah.
um, but then he does pass away. There is a he has a funeral, and Audrey, who has been having issues in her marriage this entire time, really starts to pull away at this point. And you also get the description of what happens to Laird's body. But yeah, this is definitely a story of disconnection.
Yes. This was one where I like really quite enjoyed it, and I know that you didn't like it as much. I feel like this was one of our points of contention when we were talking about these stories. Um Not that like we're completely on opposing sides, but like it was one of the ones where like we had a different reaction to the story, which is interesting, and it's why we do this channel. Like we enjoy having these conversations where it's like, no, actually, I think you're wrong. I think it's this way. It's just fun for us, and it's not in any way mean spirited between us to have these discussions and disconnects. It's actually quite interesting, but. I found it really interesting, specifically the part where, like, she, despite it seeing that she's having an emotional affair, essentially, with Laird, they don't ever, like, have any sort of consummation of that, as far as we can tell. I don't think it was
Well, I mean,
confirmed.
they kiss, but the kiss is not, it's
Uh,
not like deeply passionate. It's more like,
yes.
when it's more like her saying goodbye to what could have been.
Yes. Yeah. Um, Despite that, she readily admits that they don't know each other very deeply. The thing that she likes about Laird is that it is easy to be in Laird's presence because all they do is they sit and they listen to music. They don't delve very deeply into hard topics. It just lets her exist in sort of a calm state. And that's what she enjoys about being with Laird versus being with her husband, who very much is trying to save their marriage, but that's hard. That requires them to like talk through the things that are difficult, and throughout this you see her running away from that. Like she has the opportunity to connect with him over and over and over again. Granted, the husband also only wants to connect on his terms, which isn't helpful. Like most of the time he doesn't seem to respect her thoughts and opinions and just wants her to be part of his life. He keeps trying to drag her into his life instead of trying to create a shared life. So it's
And the one time that she does go out with him, she makes the comment that he's much older than his coworkers, and she's not even sure if he's actually having a good time
yeah,
or if this whole thing is a performance.
right.
So, he's trying to, like, say, well, we have to go out and have a life. And she's just like, is this a life? Like, is this real? Like,
Yeah.
or is this just something you're doing as a performance?
Yeah. And I honestly, that is something that is very deeply ingrained in me as a person who interacts with the world very differently than how my family does. The number, like I don't know if you can also relate to this, probably. But as someone who had like really bad depression, My family did not understand that. They had never experienced it. They could not understand it. And their way of fixing it was like, go out and spend time with people, go out and get drinks with friends, go take a walk, go out and do this. And they could not wrap their minds around why that was so difficult and actually like would be counterproductive for me as an individual. And I feel like I related to her on this level of like her husband is not seeing her pain, doesn't feel like she has pain, and feels like she should just be able to be happy, and doesn't understand why she can't move past this, because in his mind his pain is greater than hers. As an EMT, he's supposed to save people, and he's been working through this plague where he can't, there's nothing he can do to save these people, and she already works with the dead. So all of these dead bodies are great for her, right? Like this should be great for her. It's science. This is what she wanted to do. She doesn't understand the pain of not being able to save people, not really taking into account that her work is trying to save people. She's trying to understand the pathology so that she can say, this is how it's contracted, this is how we can avoid it. Like
Yeah.
that is what her
I think
work
an
is.
important factor though to their marriage is that she makes note that in the beginning they pretended it was
Yes.
easy and it wasn't. She
Yeah.
talks about them like making dinner or going to like and like having to have like conversation cards to like keep a conversation flowing.
Yeah.
And so this relationship has always been something where like they had to work to
Yep.
make it work,
Yep.
which is one of the reasons that she enjoys spending time with Laird, because for the first time she doesn't have to work in a relationship, right? She can just be there.
Yep.
um and so I mean part of her like disconnection is that she's just like giving up on the performance, right? She's just like,
Yep.
I just can't do this
Which is
anymore.
valid.
Which, yeah, which is a valid like, don't stay, don't stay in those relationships, ladies.
Yeah.
um yeah, I mean, I don't, in terms of like, I thought the story was fine.
Yeah. I
Like
I do still feel think blah, blah. I do still think it's interesting that it's unfortunate, but also she's choosing a relationship that is also doomed.
yeah,
She knows this person is dying and that there's nothing that she can do about it. And yes, it is easier for her, but she is also still just like choosing something that is doomed over something else that is doomed. It's interesting. It's an interesting story. I don't know. There's a lot of layers to that one as well. Even if for you it didn't hit quite as hard as it did for me. Like I there was a lot of echoes in here that I really appreciated. Also, things to note about Michaela. I had an anthropology degree, so like I also relate to the character on that level as someone who has spent a lot of time with dead bodies. Um, there is this element of other people looking at you and thinking like, oh, you don't feel anything because most people can't be around dead bodies. It just the existence of a body is hard for a lot of people. um but that doesn't mean that these people are unaffected by what's going on around them. It's just a different relationship to it. So yeah, this
yeah,
one hit me a lot harder than it hit you, and I appreciate that, like that
yeah,
these stories have those facets.
yeah. And that's again, read this with people.
Yes, yeah.
So the next story is Life Around the Event Horizon. And this is, all things considered, quite a quick one for the fact that it just says, hey, what if a black hole was in somebody's head? And then just kind of moves on.
Yeah.
And you're like, wait, 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 wait. So this brings you back to, if you remember Dennis from the Elegy Hotel and his super smart scientist brother, um, who like the rest of his family thought was perfect. He is the narrator of this story. You learn that at this point, his he has lost a wife, and he has also lost a daughter. Not necessarily together, but his daughter did die of the plague. And Dennis kind of like shows up, like he also helped at the Elegy Hotel, and he's still at the Elegy Hotel at this point doing his thing, and he helped like indentured himself more basically to pay for Petal's services, the daughter's services. Um, and Brian has remarried to someone who used to be one of his grad students. Her name is Teresa. And his preteen son is going through his goth phase, and he is not about this.
Yeah.
He has
Understandably
decided his
so.
name is Axel,
Yep.
and he thinks his dad got remarried too fast. It's weird. He don't like it. And also, his father has planted a black hole in his own head as an attempt. So at this point, they have begun to believe that Earth may not be savable. The climate crisis plus the plague, um, they need to start getting like space flights out to try to find other planets to potentially keep humanity alive because Earth may not be salvageable. And so Brian and Teresa have been doing work on singularities and astrophysics and all that type of stuff to try to like power a space engine. Um, so it's he just put one in his head. It's not really bothering him. It's just there. He says that it's like kind of eating him slowly, but
Yeah,
like it's mostly fine. He's just like going to the store to get like toilet paper and clementines and then going to work and everybody's like, "Hey, how are you?" And he's like, "I'm fine." And there's a black hole in his head.
he's saying it's eating him subatomic particle by subatomic particle. So it's
Yeah.
literally like taking an electron here, taking it.
I this one was definitely one of the ones where like the audiobook started and I paused it and I went back like 2 minutes and I was like, did I just hear what I thought I heard? And like, I mean, he does say later on that like he like messed with some of the like safety settings in his lab and he like kind of sort of did this on purpose.
It was implied that it was like maybe a suicide attempt.
Yeah.
Um, it wasn't 100% confirmed. He isn't even sure if it was a suicide attempt. It was kind of like a fuck it moment of just like,
Yeah.
and if I
Because
die,
he's
I die.
Yeah, because he's at this point dedicated to like, he's depressed. He talks a lot about hoping that maybe the black hole will be some kind of portal where he can like go to a space and a time where his wife and his daughter are still alive. Um,
More so, I feel like his daughter than
his yeah,
his
his daughter
wife. He's
especially.
very beat up about the loss of the daughter. Like
Yeah,
not that
much
I've,
like Fitch's father. He
yes.
feels like he should have been able to, with all his brains and all of this,
What's
like
the
he's
good
been
of
the
it if he couldn't save
yeah.
her?
And that he's been treated like the star of his family and all that type of, and he couldn't save his daughter, and now his son hates him. Or I mean, he's going through his teenage goth years, so he's having his moment.
Would have
But
hated him anyway for any mo
yeah,
any reason.
um, yeah, that's the story.
That is the story. Um, as far as like again, this one didn't have the same emotional poignancy that a lot of them did, I feel like. Um,
This is one of the like interlude stories where like this piece of
yes.
information or this event needs to occur for a future story.
Yes.
And because it's like it's not very long. Like there are some of them that are like 15 minutes and some of them that are like closer to an hour, right? And this is one of the really short ones that I'm calling like an interlude chapter where it's like this thing will happen and there will be some very good writing, some very poignant writing, but it's not deep.
I guess the thing that could be said is like, okay, is the black hole representative of his grief? Because a lot of people do feel like they're going about their day-to-day life with this thing that is inside of them that is slowly picking away at everything that makes them them, and they're just going to the store and buying oranges. Like there is that layer of it.
Yeah.
Um, he has a physical black hole on his head, but like, what is the black hole? Is the black hole the grief? Is it like he still has his son, but his son isn't connecting to him? Is it even worth it to keep trying to connect? Like
Yeah.
what is this point? He tries to get remarried with a person that is very like-minded to him, that he respects. Their relationship, I I don't know. it didn't feel romantic to me. It felt like a relationship built on mutual respect and understanding more so than like
Yes.
love. Um,
And this will make a later chapter more confusing to me.
yeah.
Yes, this one happens. This is a long video. I think we can just move on because the next
Yes.
chapter is
Yeah.
so much better.
It's there, but yes, this one is definitely not one of the
Yes.
big ones.
So the next one is a gallery, a century, a cry, a millennium, right? Is
Yes.
that the right? It's
Yes.
long. I just keep calling it a gallery in my head. So this chapter is so interesting. And when after I read it, I messaged Michaela and I said, I'm really confused that that was not the end of the book. There will be reasons for that, but one of the reasons you can already start to immediately see is, so if you go back to Cliff, right, who was our narrator of the first one, and Clara, who was the daughter that died. Cliff left behind his wife, Mickey, and Clara left behind her daughter, Yumi. And so Mickey and Yumi are still alive, years into the plague. And Brian has managed to, by this point, remove the singularity from his head and put it in a spaceship engine. And this is what I mean about that chapter, like kind of just like being the thing that makes this chapter happen.
Yep.
Um, and so there is a team of people getting on a spaceship to go try to find a new planet. Because again, at this point, they're still not sure that the plague can be cured. They don't know if the climate crisis can be reversed, and they need to get off this planet. So they brought with them some children who will stay in stasis the entire journey. And then they've brought with them adults who will kind of come in and out of stasis for like potentially weeks at a time, so that they can go on away missions to potential planets, all that type of stuff. Several characters make a comeback, such as Val, who is Dennis's partner. You see that Dennis has chosen to stay behind and continue to work at the Elegy Hotel, while Val has gotten on the spaceship. Also on the spaceship, you will later find out, is Dory, Fitch's mom. And she and Mickey will both be working as artists on the ship to kind of memorialize their journey, because a lot of the ship's inhabitants, either they'll be in stasis when something happens, or like Yumi will not be woken up until they find a habitable planet. So this is meant to memorialize in art the different planets and their different adventures. And Mickey has the journal that Clara was writing in, that Cliff was writing in, and now she's writing letters to both Cliff, to Clara, and then to Yumi, so that she has this when she wakes up. One of the things that I really liked about this chapter is that there was a lot of misses. Um, and there was moments when they thought they had found the perfect planet, multiple different ways that it went completely wrong. Um, and you also get to see these characters that were going through all this grief from like the first chapter, kind of having their story kind of like resolved. Um, and I think this is one of the very, very few that at the end I was like, oh, like in a good way.
Yeah.
Because there was definitely sad moments of that story, but it ends with them finding a planet to colonize, and her, because Mickey's been going through a lot of things about like not being sure this was the right thing to like make Yumi do, and then like looking at the possibilities that are there for them, for their future.
I feel like for me, when I was reading this, I kept getting reminded of the Becky Chambers novella that we read, To Be Taught If Fortunate, which has like a
Mm.
very similar like plot point of a crew of people who are going out to a bunch of planets that could host humans potentially. And they're traveling along, and the reconciling of someone who is doing space travel that um everybody they know and love is going to die while they are sleeping and traveling. Um,
Yeah, I think it takes them like 6,000 years to find
yes.
this planet. So intermittently they'll get messages from Earth, but like they realize that like oh, my uncle or like my son had a kid and like, oh my God, that kid would be older than me now, or like,
Yep.
whatever.
So like physically they're not aging because they're constantly in cryostasis or they're aging a couple weeks at a time, but like in real time for people on Earth, like generations and generations and generations of people are dying. Um and living and dying and living and dying. I do find it very funny that we find out that a cure was found for the plague during this chapter. When we are so far removed from that that it just kind of is a footnote.
Yeah.
It's just like mentioned. Oh, they cured it.
By the way,
Hey,
this entire reason that you left, don't
cured
worry
it.
about it. It's fine.
It is also kind of mentioned that they, as a ship, make the decision to keep going forward at that point because they could, in theory, turn around and go back to Earth. But because they were going forward, they don't know whether the climate crisis is going to be resolved or whatever else. So they're still like, at least if we can find a habitable planet, humans will continue somewhere else, which is very much a big idea in most science fiction books is especially the like hope punk genre of sci-fi where it's like we're going out to make sure that we continue and try to do better. Like we're going to try and do our best here. However that may be. Um I feel like the use of art represented here as a core of humanity and through storytelling, and obviously there is the writing there as well, but she's not just drawing like a still life of what she's looking at. Quite often they're mixing what they're looking at with bits of their memories back on Earth as well, like they're adding in the people who are dead to these murals that they're painting everywhere, as a sort of memorialization that will last a lot longer, but it also twists history and reality in a way that, like, all of these kids are going to wake up and see these. And yes, the vision that is here is partially true, but it is also partially wrong. It's a very interesting take on the way that we record history, and who's doing the recording has such a big fingerprint left on it that it almost completely changes what is being recorded here.
Yeah.
It is a very interesting story, and it's one of the things that I really love about sci-fi as a genre. Like the thoughts that you think about when you're looking at this chapter is very much like core of what I love about hope punk, but also just science fiction. I we had the conversation before we started recording this about how this is very much a science fiction novel, but it is shelved in the fiction section because it's literary. Um, and I feel like that does a disservice both to this book and also to science fiction as a genre, not to put it in science fiction, because you're essentially saying that the writing quality of this book means that it can't go into genre fiction. When a lot of the things that it's talking about, sure, yes, it's literary, it's talking about what it means to be human, but it is also asking the same questions that dozens of books in sci-fi are asking. Um, and sure, putting this next to a Star Wars book isn't exactly the same thing. You're not getting the same thing out of it, but that doesn't mean that this doesn't deserve representation there, or that sci-fi doesn't deserve to get the spotlight shown on it on what it can do. Because it is science fiction. This book is science fiction. We're talking about space travel here. We're talking about the environment and plagues and the future and robotics. Like it's science fiction. It's just ticking every single box, but you find it in the fiction section of the Barnes and Noble instead of sci-fi, um, which is an interesting conversation to have as well about the sort of preconceived notions that we have about genres and who they're for, um, and I don't know, it's interesting. It's interesting.
I have almost nothing to add. Like
That's fine.
I just like I remember like I I love this chapter. I think
Yes.
this is also like a huge turning point in the novel, where like this one is definitely very overall positive. Um, don't worry, we're talking about some other stuff, but like I think like this is the turning point where like okay, now the plague is cured on Earth, um, and you still have these people with like hope basically just using hope that they're going to find a planet after
Yeah.
so many misses. And then they eventually do. Um, and then, so yeah, this chapter, I just loved it. I just loved this chapter. Just no notes. No notes.
Um,
Loved it.
I would say, and I mentioned this to you, that I feel like a lot of authors and a lot of books would have ended here.
Yes.
Like a lot of people would have said, okay, the cure has been found. We have like some sort of resolution for what's happening back on Earth, and we are ending on this note of hope, of space travel, of finding a new home, starting over, trying again. Hopefully this chance
Yep.
works.
Well, and that's, I mean, and then I said it at the top. I was like, why is this not the final chapter? Because, it ties back to the first chapter, right? It's a really excellent bookend. It's Mickey saying, I'm finishing this journal. I'm moving on with my life with Yumi and all that type of stuff. I was like, so where do we go from here? And this book is going to do something really special. Um,
Yeah.
except not in the next chapter. No, I'm kidding. Michaela and I probably have our greatest range of difference on the chapter after this, which is called The Used to Be Party. It is one of the very quick chapters. It was only about 15 minutes. Um, and it is a man named Dan Paul who
I love
has
Dan Paul.
Dan Paul. Uh, he was cursed with two first names. So basically, part of this is also learning what has happened on Earth. So part
Yes.
of this, I consider it like an interlude chapter because it's resetting the scene about what is happening on Earth now that the plague has been essentially cured, and we're going to talk about what that means. Um, Dan had gotten the plague, as had his wife and their daughter. Prior to the pandemic, he was a lawyer, I believe,
Hmm.
right? Or like some
Yep.
kind of like how high-powered office man who was like always too busy to go to his daughter's dance recitals and like all that type of stuff. And then he wakes up from the coma because again, adults have been in comas this entire time. All of the coma patients wake up,
Yep.
and he finds out that his wife and his daughter have died. So he wakes up, he's presented with their ashes, and it's like years after he went into the coma, and the entire world has changed. And so capitalism has changed with it.
Hmm.
And many of these, like the Elegy hotels and the death capitalism, is like transitioning into like trying to help coma patients like retransition back into life and help people whose lives were, even if they didn't get the plague, were interrupted. I mean, we all lived through COVID. We know, like
Yep.
people lose jobs, you lose family, you lose your house, you whatever.
Whole
Um,
industries
yeah,
close.
Dan goes to work for a social media site where he pretends like he runs social media sites for people who are dead. So people pay to have like someone like pretend to be their dead family member or friend. And his supervisor, by the way, is Dennis. So Dennis he is just making it work. um, and so he shows up very briefly there. But basically, the actual conceit of the chapter is Dan is writing a letter to the people on his street, to his neighbors, and inviting them to a party at his house, where he is basically saying, like, I know that when before I did not come to these parties. I know that before, like you were maybe very close to my wife, before you had a partner, you had a daughter, you had a sister who I could have known better, but I didn't. But I do know that now you're also grieving, just like me. And we're all living as like individual, like, you know, planets that are circling each other, but never actually getting very close. Um, and he makes reference to the fact that for many of them, he now knows deeply personal, or he thinks he knows deeply personal things about them because of that time they all spent in the void space and viewed each other's memories. So again, this is how long it
And
takes
chucked a
that third
baby into
chapter to come back.
space.
And you're like, remember when the cheerleading tower flung the baby into the sky?
Yes.
Um, and so, but he's like referencing these really personal things that he knows about them and basically saying that like this is their chance and his chance to do better and to be better. And he knows that plenty of people who are still alive in his own family probably wish that he had died and that his daughter or his wife were the people who had made it, but it's him. He's the one who's here, and he's going to do something with that. And so he's inviting them to a used to be party so that they can reconnect, and not even reconnect, really for him, it's connect
Yeah.
on this level, to talk about what they've survived, to talk about what they're grieving, and to try to move forward better.
Yeah. For me, this was incredibly impactful. And I know that it was not the same for you. Like for me, this was one of the stories where I was really like, that one-off story that I kind of didn't think about at all, about the people in the void space, because you have woken them up and they now have to walk around in the world having experienced that, a thing that we will never experience in our lifetime, a sense of connection and knowing another person that we will never experience in our lifetime. How does that affect someone? How does that change someone on a personal level? And the thing that I found really interesting was that he does not know if what he experienced was a shared experience because nobody is talking with each other about this. He mentions how they like see each other at the grocery store, lock eyes, and then go opposite directions, because knowing someone on that level is like more than intimate. Like in society, that's like kind of like really scary for someone to know you at that level.
And I mean, I'm sorry, but because in this void world, they didn't ask permission,
No.
potentially quite violated.
Yes. 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 Um, but he is asking his neighbors, was this real or was this something that my mind just made up? Because he doesn't actually know if they all experienced the same thing or if this was just a coma dream for him. And he's making up these backstories, like his brain just made up stuff about the people he saw every day on the street. For me, it was so profound of a moment of going, these people that I see every single day, I walked past them. My daughter went to school with you. My wife wrote a song for you for this thing, and I didn't even know that happened. I like fully was unaware that that happened in any case, and you got to see something of her that I never got to see, and I'm grateful that I got to see it, but whatever else, like you're not just, the way that I described it was that you're not just NPCs in my life. You're not in a video game these like pre-programmed characters that just say the same thing over and over and over again. You are a fully realized human with memories and dreams and grief. And so am I. And I'm reaching out to you and nearly begging you to please acknowledge me and let me acknowledge you as like a core human experience. This is like what I feel like is so important about living in community, is seeing each other. I'm crying again. um it hit me so hard, this like core want of shared experience that I feel like a lot of us are lacking. And that's why this second story after this pissed me off so much.
Okay,
So
the story after this, the fact that they are a 1-2 punch, that is the only reason I find any meaning in this story. Okay, I know Michaela's crying, and that is gonna make me the fucking Grinch. I understand. But the first thing I said to Michaela was, I was like, this is a Hallmark movie, but with death instead of Christmas. Okay. I feel like, and Michaela admitted that, like, you know, maybe she hasn't read as many of these, but I feel like mid to end mid pandemic, there were so many of these think pieces, right? The New Yorker, the Atlantic, WAPA, whatever, you know, whatever magazine you want to say, about people being like, you know, the lessons this pandemic has taught us about people. To be fair, I agree with everything Michaela just said, and it is a detriment to everyone's humanity. That, like, I used to describe this all the time, that like I mean, I've worked in food service my whole life, right? But I worked in the dining hall in our undergrad college, and I would put that uniform on and stand behind the counter, and my friends would come through the dining hall and they wouldn't even notice me.
Yep.
Because like particularly retail food service, like people, there was just like no like connection of humanity there. So
Yeah,
like I
you're invisible.
100%
Yeah.
yeah, agree with everything that she just said. I think for me, again, when you go back to like I cannot unpin this chapter from the pandemic we experienced.
Yeah.
I cannot unpin this chapter from the multiple versions of this letter I have listened or read from real people during the pandemic. I also know, based on what has happened since those were published, how little that has actively changed the world.
Yeah.
And so I think for me, this story in isolation, it didn't hit that. It honestly just, I was like, oh, well, of course this had to happen. Right. As like the pandemic, like, yeah, like, the author also read The Atlantic after the pandemic and was like, people were doing this. Yeah. But then I also just have like the anger at our world for not meaning it,
Yeah.
or at least the bulk of people not meaning it. Right. So Dan Paul is a precious little pumpkin.
I love him so
I
much.
love him so much. And I think the thing that makes me love this chapter more in retrospect is the fact that he shows up very briefly in a later chapter, putting his money where his mouth is. So you
Yes.
also get like the proof that after he wrote this, like they had that party and he really meant it and they did the thing. And I'm like, you are amazing, Dan Paul. You go, dude.
You make those connections with your
You do
neighbors.
it, man. So let me just say that like I agree with every sentiment. I agree, like, I mean, the reason that Michaela cried should be the reason that we all cry, because honestly, like, we should think about that ourselves more in our daily lives. I get that, like, I say hello in the school hallways to like the janitors or the other people I say hi. I work with them also, but like I don't know most of these, and I swear to God, half sometimes people are just surprised that I have said hello,
Yeah.
that I have like, so if you're looking for a small way to make a difference in someone else's life, acknowledge them, you know, not an unsafe, like I understand sometimes you're a woman alone on a dark street, like don't, not unsafely, but like seriously, stop it.
Yeah. I
But
think maybe this wouldn't have hit me so hard if it wasn't for the fact that reading this after the election results, for me, I feel like a lot of where we as a humanity, or at least in this country, have lost our way is that the like sheer holding on to rugged individualism and the loss
oh
of
yeah.
community. So like reading that, maybe if I had read this a year ago or 2 years ago, I wouldn't have been impacted by this chapter in the same way that I was now. Um, and like maybe I would have felt the same way that you did of like that's a lot of talk for something that isn't going to change anything. But it exemplifies what I think is really good about humanity, what we are capable of, and what we have lost along the way somehow.
Yeah,
But
and I
it
mean,
doesn't
it's
mean
just
anything
my
if the
reaction to
collective
that is
doesn't.
like via the election is a lot of you said words you didn't mean.
Yes.
So, like, I lived that dream too. We had the chance to be better. And I'm not saying plenty of people didn't take that chance,
Yeah.
but like, generally, I was like, well,
Big
at least some of
talk.
you didn't mean it. So, but what really, really makes this chapter just like come retroactively for your jugular is the chapter afterward, which is it like Melancholy Nights in a Tokyo Hotel?
Virtual cafe. Tokyo
Virtual
Virtual
Cafe.
Cafe.
Okay. Which is the story of and this one will really throw you off. It is the only chapter written in the third person,
Yep.
which is one of the things that I needed Michaela to like confirm for me. But the main character of this one is a gentleman who did not get the plague. He did not get sick, but his entire life was derailed. He did lose family. His mother moved to a very remote village in like the Japanese mountains to try to stay healthy. And he was trying to make a career of himself in like printing and graphic design. And when everything went virtual, those jobs went out of business, and he's just been struggling to get back on his feet. And even with the help of the transition agencies and all of the way capitalism has now moved to monetize this new reality, um, he's angry, he's upset, he's frustrated, and he's lonely. And so he has started logging into VR worlds and to try to find connection. And
I should note specifically a VR chat room for suicidal people who are looking for partners for joint suicide.
yes, okay. So what I was going to say was at that moment, I was like, oh, this is very similar to the thing that I just read. And then it was like suicide chat room. And I was like, oh, this very different. So like there's like a moment where you start that chapter where you're like, is this like this seems very similar to the thing that I just read. And then it's like, haha, no.
No.
Um, it's not like this is like it's like this is in the beginning of the chapter, so it's not like this is like a jump scare. But his virtual avatar meets a woman whose virtual avatar is a Pegasus, and they strike up a friendship in this virtual world. And she doesn't really realize that he has also located her in real life. Um, but he has not yet got up the gumption to talk to her in real life, and they're talking in the virtual reality. And she tells him how she has a daughter, and her husband is no longer in the picture, and she no longer speaks to her father. And so she's on her own with her kid. Her mother is dead. And her daughter got the plague and is now alive, but enough of her internal organs and brain have they've been able to stop the transmogrification, but her kid is no longer the same. You know,
Essentially
she gets,
disabled, like
yeah,
completely mentally and physically disabled from this plague.
she gets violent. She is still in pain. She cannot communicate. Um, and Yoshiko just doesn't know how to handle her. And she's like just trying her hardest to like survive for the both of them. The dude ends up getting a job working an old timey printing press for someone printing like extremist leaflets.
The world is ending, the end is nigh.
Like the 10th planet of orbit will collide and
Yeah.
like that type of a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, come to find out that that's her dad. um, but this one will take you out, especially like between like the one on the spaceship and then the used to be party, which are two positive ones really in a row, or at least hopeful,
Yeah.
shall we say, hopeful about the future. And then you really get the sense that the main character of this story, he's also lonely. He like finds through Yoshiko someone who he wants to reach out to, and he wants to have this connection with her. And he says to her multiple times, I want to take care of you. I want to help you with your daughter. Um, and then at the end of the chapter, um, they it's like a I guess a murder suicide. I don't know that her daughter really would have consented to that, but there are new underground companies that are helping people to safely end their own lives, I suppose you could say.
Yeah, they're like sending you drugs in the mail that you can take that
Yeah,
will essentially let you fall asleep to die. Um,
yeah. And so they are both dead.
yeah.
So it's very, very sad. It does have a uplifting moment at the end where this convinces him, because he says in the beginning that he's been lying to his mom this whole time, that he's fine, his life is fine, they haven't really talked. And in the end, he's like, I'm gonna go home.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go see my mom. Um, so I mean, there's that.
Yeah. My reaction to this was to become violently angry on the backs of the last. I was like, I am so pissed. I am so pissed off because this feels so true to the reality that we live in today post-pandemic of people who lost everything. They lost the people they cared about, they lost their jobs, they lost their career. They don't know what to do with themselves. Um, the reality of like go back to the capitalism grind, guys. Like the plague is gone, so let's go back to reality and half of the people are logging into VR to go to fake baseball games and pretend that you're in a stadium full of people because that's safe. I just want to go back to how it was. I just want this new reality. I don't like it. It's sad and hard to face. So I'm going to try and force us into what we were before. And some people are dying because they can't find a place in this weird, not quite the past, but not really changing anything. Um, People aren't able to find new careers that support them anymore, and the government handouts are now running down because you should be able to transition at this point. And it was like I really want to know if this was written pre-pandemic or not, because if it was written pre-pandemic, it is so on the nose to the point that I'm like it hurts.
Nostradamus, is that you? Yeah, and I mean that's why, like, you get, we talked earlier about how some chapters maybe should have been reordered, but these are two for me that are just fused
Yeah.
because having, it's the choice. You can
Yeah.
either choose to be Dan Paul or not. And the thing that I think, again, if you go back to careful attention, is that there is no judgment on either way. You totally, like, you you see how a mother can be driven to this. Because I mean, and it goes back to what is humanity? Was her daughter living?
Yeah, it echoes back to City of Laughter of like this child sure is alive right now, but what is the quality of life? Is it worth it?
Yeah, she talks about how she's in pain all the time. There are nights when her daughter will just scream all night and she doesn't know if she's hurt, if she's hungry. Um, it's awful.
Yeah.
It's awful. And this is, I think, if we go back to why wasn't Miku and Yumi's chapter, or Miki and Yumi's chapter, like the last chapter, because this is the reality. There are people left on Earth picking up the pieces, and just because the cure has come, there are still people suffering. And in the way that the government has said, everything's fine now, back to capitalism.
Yeah.
Not that we know anything about.
As someone who had our plague and has been irreparably damaged by it in a way that I can't get back. There's a lot of people who became disabled. It was a mass disabling event. And I really appreciate a book taking a look at that and saying, hey, you can't just go back to normal no matter how much the red hat people want us to go back to something. For a lot of us, that is not a thing that we're able to do.
Yeah.
Um, Physically, emotionally, and trying to force us to go backwards is re-traumatizing in a lot of ways and dehumanizing in a lot of ways because it is willfully ignorant of the reality of so many people.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's
Yeah.
that. It made me so mad, but another one that like really hit the nail on the head of
Yeah, I
like,
mean, I think if you like, that's probably like the hardest chapter of the second half of the book.
yes, 100%. I honestly thought when we saw that review that said it's too hopeful, this book, that I was like, is it just like the second half just is all hope? Like we
I
have
know.
this first half of just depression after depression after depression, and then the second half is just hopeful, hopeful, hopeful. Like, is that it? But it's not because
It's
this is
not.
here.
Friends, I would like to, well, and then I mean, you have to, so, and then you have the next one,
Yeah.
which is, I keep calling it the Ice Viking ship, but it's called Before You Melt into the Sea, right?
Yep. Yep.
Um, I'm curious about the purpose of this one.
I think it is another play on the mass disabling thing.
I immediately after like all of the themes and stuff that we just talked about in um the Melancholy Nights one, for me connects so well to the story after Before You Melt into the Sea, which is called Grave Friends. And so I'm also just like, so why is it in the middle? Why is it in
Yes.
the middle of these?
Yes. Yeah.
Um, but obviously, like it couldn't go in between the Used to Be Party and Melancholy Nights. It
Yeah.
couldn't go before the Used to Be Party. So I feel
No.
like this one is just kind of here.
Yeah.
And it does, I think maybe that's part of the reason why it doesn't work so well. But anyway, Before You Melt into the Sea is what is even his name?
I don't even know if we learn his name. It He
The
doesn't
narrator.
interact with anyone. He just
Yeah.
writes a letter to a dead person.
So this is another one in the form of a letter, and it is someone who has pioneered a new way to die. I do think okay, so like I know what I said, but like I do think that this a lot of what's also talking about in this chapter is like after you have dealt with so much death, how have people's views about death changed?
Yeah.
And how we deal with death and what we do with dead bodies.
Yep.
What that means. So he has pioneered and he gives us his like Better Business Bureau rating and some stuff there in the beginning, death capitalism, about where he takes a dead body and he liquefies them and he basically makes them into like an ice sculpture of like they help him design it. And then there's like I keep calling it the Viking ice ship because essentially they like the family, friends, whatever, gather at like a beach, and he takes the ice sculpture out into the sea or the lake or whatever, and then everybody like watches it melt, and that person then becomes one with um, that body of water. Um, and so to me, it's like the reverse of like the flame ship, right? The flame, like it's just like you ice and you go out and you melt.
Yeah.
Um, but this is another one where the person who is dying, her name is Mabel, and she did get the plague, and she is dealing. The after effects are killing her,
Yeah.
even though there is a vaccine, there is a cure. She cannot be saved. And so again, another reason I understand why this is here, but like it's in a weird place. Um, and through their late night video chats, as he is designing her, you know, he does the drawing for the ice sculpture she will eventually become, and like her ceremony, where she wants to go out to sea, all that type of stuff. They become friends,
Mm.
acquainted strangers. They do talk about like watching a movie together at one point, that like, you know, it does clearly go beyond the professional relationship that this guy has with other clients. Um, he does ask her to if he can go visit her in the hospital, and she says no. Um, and then it talks about how when she does die, he gets her body, the process that her body goes through. He makes the ice sculpture, takes her out to sea, and then, unlike other people, he stays with her until she fully melts away.
I do you want to talk about why this was frustrating for you? Because this was one of the ones that you felt like was like this is kind of just the same thing as some of the previous chapters that we have had.
I mean, again, I would like to say I already referenced a number of ways in which the story is different, but like tonally,
Yeah.
it really just felt like Songs of Your Decay again, of someone who is in a professional position speaking to someone whose body they will later have ownership of, and like falling in love with that person. And so like Audrey in Songs of Your Decay like kisses Laird, and there is some suggestion that Laird did have feelings for her as well, or like the ghost of what could have been again.
Yeah.
Mabel definitely did not have feelings for this guy, but he asked to see her at the hospital. And so there's also like this feeling in both of those relationships for me. There's a little bit of a weird power dynamic as well that I'm just like, why did this happen twice?
Yeah.
I mean, and again, I understand that the situations were different. The chapters are doing different things. Um, but it did, and again, I understand what this story is doing for the world in itself, but where it gets placed in the book as well, if I was already like, it already feels a little bit like an echo of another story we've already read. And I
Yeah.
don't know what this is adding, because I think the conversation between Melancholy Nights and Grave Friends is such a more interesting conversation that having this in the middle interrupted the flow for me a little bit.
Gotcha.
But like, again, I think it's a really, really weird and interesting concept.
Yeah.
Um, that does a lot more things with the death capitalism thing as well, which has also been interesting throughout the book. But like, there was nowhere else for it to go, but I wanted it to be somewhere else.
Yeah, I feel like for me, things about this that resonated a little bit was this reflection that this is still happening even after the plague is cured, right? Like this thing of like death doesn't go away just because there's no longer a big plague. This I think what I talked about when we were talking about this earlier was that I was talking about how both of these are people who are experiencing something very intimate with someone the very end of their life. And that sort of creates like a false closeness that may not have been there previously. Laird obviously had a previous relationship with the person who's going to get his body, and then this person is just being introduced at the end of her life. Um, but it's still this thing of like you are getting to know someone in a way that like is very different from the way that most people get to know somebody. You know there is a finite amount of time on this relationship, and by engaging with the growth of love and the growth of understanding anyway, is very interesting to me. And I think it was sort of meant to be looking at the way that the emotional connection that we have with other people defies logic in a way, because logically, this person has no reason to have this connection with this woman. He knows she's dying. He's just here to do a job, but he still feels some sort of connection with her, whether it was because they could have been something had she not been dying, or what have you. And the starts of that happen regardless, even with the knowledge that like it's already a foregone conclusion. She's already going to die.
Yeah.
Um,
I just like, it felt also uncomfortable to have the repetition of like the guy in Melancholy Nights says to Yushiko, like, I think, can I meet you in person? And she goes, I thought you understood what this relationship was. And he's like, I can do this. Like, I can care for you. I can. And she's like clearly saying no. And he's like,
yeah,
but please. And it's the same thing in this one where he's like, can I come see you at the hospital? And she's like, no,
yeah,
like, this is not what this is.
yeah.
Um, and it just felt uncomfortable for that to happen twice.
I do agree that there is an element of like maybe on top of the fact that we are both women and we understand unwanted advances from men that like that, especially back to back, this happening, that does feel uncomfortable.
Especially
um
knowing that like Mabel is dying and Yoshiko is going through all of this stuff. And I understand that both those dudes' hearts were in the right places, but it just seems like if you go back to like Audrey's husband saying that like my needs come before yours, it's like, well, I want this connection with you. Like, why won't you play ball? And
Yeah.
them being like, Mabel's like, I'm literally dying.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's not like it's a huge part of it, but like when it happened like twice in a
Multiple
row,
times. Yeah.
I was just like, I agree. I mean, this is written by a man,
The fact that it's
but
echoing, though, like, are we supposed to empathize with these men, or are we supposed to find it uncomfortable and weird? That's my question. I don't know. I don't know if he's saying like empathize with these men. I don't know
well,
that
I mean,
that's
we're
what he's
supposed to be
saying.
happy that the guy from Melancholy Nights gets his happy ending, right? He's going home to his mom.
Yes. There's a difference between empathizing with his weird stalkery behavior. It's also interesting because that guy is in third person
Yeah.
and his whole thing
And he goes in like to the market and just like stares at her. And I was like, okay, Edward, calm down.
weirdo. um this guy at least sort of seems to acknowledge that his relationship is weird. He makes the comment about he thought about kissing her before putting her body into the the machine to liquefy her,
Yeah.
but just thought that that was weird and that he shouldn't do it. And I was like, good for you, bro, for not violating a dead body.
Well, and then he also talks about like putting her hands over her privates because she wanted to go out with I don't that chapter is weird. Okay. It's weird
Yeah.
and this video is really long.
We don't have answers for you. We don't know
No.
how to fix that. If you have answers, tell us because yeah. I
If
also
you're still
agree.
here, how
Yeah.
long are we in? 3 hours? I don't want to talk about this weird one anymore. I want to talk about one of the most interesting chapters of the second half for me, which is Grave Friends.
Yep.
And this is the moment where I just texted Michaela and I was like, thank God this book didn't end with Mickey and Yumi's chapter because this is so interesting.
Yep.
So, the previous chapters that we've just talked about have occurred vaguely after the end of the pandemic, right? This one is actually a few generations removed because they talk about, for example, having the dog Hollywood, whose like dead electronic body they have that used to like be owned by a great great aunt. So
Yes.
like it's like a generation removed. Um, and a woman named Rena is going back to visit her family in Japan. She has basically run away, not run away, but like she's been living in the US. She has been estranged from her family, but her grandmother has died and she's going back for the funeral. And the reason that her family took her move to the United States so hard is that her family lives on this street in Japan where during the pandemic, it started as like a cost saving measure. They all were putting the ashes of their dead in the same urn. And this created such a strong bond between the families in this neighborhood. Like, think about what Dan Paul is trying to do, but like on steroids.
Yeah, like to a
Um,
cult level.
yeah, there's multiple references from people like, we're not a cult, but like, but anyway, they just, it's such a strong bond between these families. And basically, people at this point, they grow up on this street, they don't leave this street, they're a part of this community, they're a part of this like extended family. Um, and Rena had the audacity to leave. Um, and this was really, really hard on her family. And so she's coming back for the funeral of her grandmother, who she was very close to. However, she hadn't talked to her family in a while, so she hadn't talked to her grandmother for a while. She wasn't there when she died. Um, and she has a lot of guilt about that and
Yes.
has guilt about leaving her family and also questions it too. You know, she's like, I am happy with my husband in, you know, America and where I am, but also like, I do miss this closeness, but like also like, is this tradition that was started out of necessity and really helped these people get through a very dark time? Is it now something that goes from being a help to a hindrance because the people who are within this cult aren't moving on, you know, from this position?
Yeah.
Um, And like she talks to some younger cousins or people on the street who are like desperate to get out of the situation, but they don't have like the money, they don't have the ability. Um, and it is such a good story about, again, those ripple effects, right? That like we're not even talking about the immediate aftermath of the pandemic trying to put the world back together, right? The world at this point is a generation removed from that. And now it's the effect that growing up during this is having on the next generation of people who have led regular lives in a post-pandemic world,
Yeah.
and are like still being affected by the it's again, another book might have ended with Mickey's chapter, Finding Hope. Another book may have ended with the immediate after effects of the pandemic. This takes it that extra step further and is like, listen, this isn't something that just affects this immediate area, right? There are things that will happen here that will ripple out and affect families and traditions and lie like for a long time. Um, Along with saying very interesting things about family, like being close versus to going out on your own versus, I love this chapter. No notes.
No notes.
No
Um,
notes.
yeah. It also says interesting things because the climate crisis continues.
Oh yeah.
Like it talks about how um Japan is like slowly being submerged underwater, and how their street has sea walls so high to keep the ocean out that they can't even see the sky anymore. You just look out the window and see a concrete wall. um it also talks about like the Japanese funerary experience, where there's like these skyscraper things where everybody has like a floor in the skyscraper you go to, and then like a robot like lifts up the urn out of somewhere. And presumably like a bunch of like 100 or whatever many people are all on this floor, and you have like this one little area in like a big warehouse space full of urns that like they robot goes, finds the urn and brings your urn so that you can pay respects, but it's not
That
like
was
a
true in Speak
cemetery.
Dutch, I Love You, though.
Also, yes, so
Yeah.
like this has continued as like the new norm of how they're doing funerals, although it's added in the
Holograms.
hologram. Yeah, you can like sit with your grandmother, which
I
is a bit
I'm
weird.
sorry. I don't That's weird.
Yeah, I don't know that I want to sit with the hologram version. The narrator in this quite likes that she can like sit, and like they can bring up multiple holograms. Like she brings up like her grandmother and her grandfather and aunts and uncles, and like they're all still together, and that I do think that like reflects with the one urn has their entire family in it. It's
Yeah.
no longer
But
just
it's also like
grandma.
a changing, with the VR, and it's like more possible to have like your image like existing after your death.
Yes.
So like if you go back to like, the ice melt body, like the body is in this new world like not that important anymore.
Yeah.
And it's like your image and who you were. But I think it's also like meant to be a little weird, but like it's
Yeah.
normal to Rena because this is the world that she's grown up in.
Yeah. It's how we're all talking about like what pandemic babies are going to be like, because they're never going to understand a world before this time, in the same way that we look at Gen Z who don't know a world before 9/11, in the
Yeah.
same way that Gen X looks at millennials who don't know a world before computers, in the same, like it just
Yeah.
keeps rippling back of like there will always be a major shift or event that happens that irreparably changes each generation as it comes, and we never know what that event is going to be and what effects that event is going to have on the way that we interact with each other, interact with the world, relate to people. And I think the thing that was really interesting about this is that even after Dan Paul tried to get everybody to connect with each other on their block party, um it people still are missing each other. Like the
Oh my God,
disconnect
we
is
left. Hold
still
on. I'm
there.
sorry. I just need to let everyone know that Dan Paul was in Before You Melt into the Sea. This
Yes.
is very important. He was there. He helped arrange Mabel's funeral because she was a daughter of a neighbor. So Dan Paul out there doing Viking ice funerals for his neighbors. Sorry. Anyway, continue.
Dan Paul living his life. Best guy. Hero of the story, Dan Paul. Um, but yeah, like the when you see all of the people before and during the pandemic who are constantly away from their family, they're physically distant from their family, they're emotionally distant from their family, they're failing on so many levels to connect with each other. And then you get to see this thing that is so far removed from the events of the catastrophe, and people are still doing this. They're still physically removed from their family. They're
But
still missing each other.
but I think the key to this one though is that Rena has been distant
Yeah.
because they tried to hold her too close.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that is a key that even as this novel has been talking about needing to connect and needing to be closer and needing these relationships, that there is a point at which you have become too close.
Yeah.
There is a point at which these people, like the people around you, don't have room to grow because you're holding on to them so tightly.
Yeah.
And that I think makes this a fantastic chapter also to have near the end because it has said over and over and over again this need to connect, all that type of stuff, which is true,
Yes.
but that there is this consequence of too much.
Yeah. This thing of like we haven't talked about it a whole lot, but there is a lot of themes throughout this book, specifically around parenthood and what it means
Yeah.
to have children. And I think
Oh,
that
I
this
figured we'd get to that in the next one.
we will. I think we'll talk about it more in the I will talk about it more in the next one, but I do feel like this one very much talks about like when parents don't recognize that their children are separate from them and that they are their own human beings and they're not just their little dolls that they can dress up and make do whatever they want them to do. This one does sort of talk about that human side of being a parent and like
Yeah.
this want to like to the detriment of the child want even though you want the best for them and what you believe is the best for them, there becomes a point where that becomes stifling and in the same way that Dennis was not able to live up to his parents' dreams, Raina is not able to live up to her parents' dreams here.
Yeah. And I mean that's probably why this one is so personal to me because like, both of my brothers still live at home with my parents. Um and they are very close and they work together and they're all and like I used to be a part of that, but I'm the only one that's left, right?
Yeah.
And so there's always that moment of like that tension of like I really need to be my own person, but like I also have a nostalgia for that thing that I lost, but also like I could not continue to live, like I had to go.
Yes. Yeah.
And yeah, this one on top of everything else, I think, and in the grand scheme of the novel as well, just I think it fit really well.
Yeah, I agree. It was a very good one. I will also say, having the book in front of me, there is an actual dog mentioned. A miniature poodle that belonged to my cousin came up in the
Oh, that's right. There's a
holograms.
dog in that one. Okay, we're
There
fine,
are
guys. The
still
dog
animals.
survived the pandemic. That's where we don't know where the cats are, but I'm assuming if dogs made it, the cats are fine. Okay, all right. We have to. Okay, so here we are. I'm riding super high on like the fumes of grave friends. And then comes the final full chapter of this book, which is called The Scope of Possibility. Now, I will note that this chapter does wrap together many of the themes of this novel. However, I also want to ask what the fuck. Okay. So it is unclear in the beginning, like who the narrator of this is. But you get this, like she is this person is telling a story, telling the story of her life. And you learn that she is from another planet. And this is a planet on which they cultivate the seeds that will go out and become new planets. And every person on her planet is given basically stewardship of a seed. And they can look into these seeds with a possibility scope and see the different possible futures and outcomes for the society and the civilizations and this world. And so we hear the story of this particular person who has a husband and a daughter on this planet, but she has been given stewardship of Earth, what we would know as Earth. And so she has to leave her husband and her daughter behind on their planet, which is dying in some capacity.
Yes.
To go out and be the steward of Earth. These are energy beings. They talk about having see-through skin and you can see like light pulsing in their veins. They're also apparently immortal. And so she goes to Earth and begins life as like a, single atom creature and, does the whole evolutionary process as the planet does. But around the time of the cavemen, she gets a little lonely. And she decides to have a relationship with another Neanderthal. And she thinks she has done her human skin correctly. And so she's able to biologically give birth to a daughter. Except for she missed a chromosome or like a gene somewhere, and her daughter begins to mutate.
Sound familiar?
Yeah. Go back 3 hours earlier in this video. And her daughter's organs begin to mutate, and this causes actually a plague among the other Neanderthals that are there, or whichever version of Homo sapien, whatever.
I think it was Neanderthal.
I think it was Neanderthal.
Yeah.
So anyway, her daughter dies, and she etches her star system. She's very sad because it also kills her husband, I believe. Basically everyone that was there. And her daughter dies, and her body freezes in the ice melt. And this woman is like, well, hope she never gets defrosted, or there will be another plague upon the earth. That'll never happen. So it talks about some of her other lives, some of the other men she's been in relationships with, such as Galileo and Isaac Newton. Talks about how she accidentally gave too much too soon to the Atlanteans and exploded Atlantis.
Oops.
Basically giving a huge entire history of Earth, as she is trying to explain how she has tried to mother Earth, go back to parents, has been missing her own daughter this entire time. She's had a number of different partners where she has given birth to non-plague ridden children, some of whom have died quite horrifically, that she's lost, all the while trying to shepherd Earth towards its scope of possibilities. Because one of the things that they had seen on her planet was that Earth would be the first planet to achieve going into space and making a connection between the planets. And they didn't know how that was going to happen, but she was trying to shepherd it towards that goal.
Yep.
Well, it happens when her first daughter gets released from the ice and a plague is upon the earth. You do find out in this chapter, which Michaela caught and I didn't, that she was Clara, so she was Cliff's daughter. She was trying to fix the climate crisis at that point. She died, it didn't work. And at this point in our story, she has come back and she is Teresa, the wife of Brian, he who had a black hole in his head.
Yeah.
And so this is her explaining this whole thing to Brian on his deathbed.
Yep.
And she is still hoping to find her actual original daughter. Her name is Nuri. They have pendants that are supposed to help them find each other. There is a reference to a woman wearing a pendant who lost her mother very suddenly in Melancholy Nights. So her daughter is indeed somewhere.
Somewhere on Earth, yeah.
Um, and that's the last chapter.
Yeah. Your response to this was, I don't know how to feel about this last chapter. And I at first was like, oh God, what does that mean? Because I was actively like finishing up the previous chapter when you messaged me this, and then I listened to this and I went, oh, okay, I understand. And my first thoughts were, this has the same problem that every ancient alien theory has for me, which is that it removes all human ingenuity from history, because it is essentially saying that the only reason that humanity was able to get to this point was because there was a person with that knowledge, an alien with the knowledge of interspace travel, because how else would she have gotten here, slowly finding the right people and like giving them the knowledge and like nudging them in the right direction in order to create the outcome that she wanted. And like, if she hadn't been here on Earth, then perhaps that wouldn't have happened in the scope of possibility, that the humans never would have left Earth or wouldn't have even evolved in the first place, because she's actually giving all of that knowledge to people to begin with. Quite often in our reality, Ancient Aliens is used to um, take away the ingenuity of people of color, for instance, if you don't know the issues of that. Like, if you are saying that the reason the Aztecs were able to build pyramids is because an alien told them they could, you're taking away this whole entire culture's ingenuity and knowledge of math and things like that, because how could they know that if math wasn't invented until later over here by this white guy? And it's like, well, because humans all over the planet are smart and figure things out all over the planet individually over and over and over again. um so there's a problem inherent in there that we have an ancient alien theory here, um, which again makes me uncomfortable, not my favorite thing. I do think that it does bring around a lot of the themes that the entire book is talking about, and so thematically, I am very comfortable with how this ends. I feel like it does a really good job to talk about the like mothering thing, the parenting thing. It does a really good job to talk about the fact that she, despite knowing that she is immortal and all of these humans are going to die, chooses again and again and again to love people. Um, Despite the foregone conclusion that this person is going to die. Um, in various capacities. She chooses again and again and again to have children, despite them dying, sometimes quite horrifically, despite having to abandon some of them in order to save herself. She'll save other people's children in certain instances that aren't even related to her, in the same way that a bunch of people got into a pyramid and tossed a baby into the sky. Um, like it does touch on everything that the book has done so far in a way that I feel like is satisfying, even if the vehicle with which it is doing that is perhaps not the most satisfying.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with anything Michaela just said. I just like was immediately rubbed the wrong way. First, for the ancient aliens is the real, true person behind the throat. Like,
Yeah.
but also like because this is about humans, flawed humans trying, some people who were trying their hardest. And if you go back to Clara before we realized she was an alien, like who died, like sacrificing her own relationship with her daughter. And I, by the way, I think it undercuts this as well, which also upsets me, which is like Clara was trying, like she wasn't able to have a really relationship with her own daughter because she was trying so hard to save the planet for her daughter. And that is also a theme of like parents trying to make a better world for their children, but not being there for their children.
Yep.
And like the tension there of like never like how it's like an unwinnable choice
Yeah.
for like her, for Fitch's dad, like that kind of a thing. Um, and so it's upsetting then to know that she's an alien, she was never gonna die anyway. But like, so she could have been there for Yumi's entire life, but whatever. Um, Like,
she was trying to prevent the events of this book, though. She was trying to prevent the plague from happening in the
well,
first place
I'm
because
aware,
she
but I'm
knew
saying it's
that
like
was there.
it's an unwinnable choice, is what
Yes,
I'm
yeah.
saying,
Yeah.
right? It's like, how do you make the best worst choice?
Yes, yeah.
And there's always going to be someone who disagrees with your choice, right?
Yes, yeah.
Like Dory disagrees, with her husband's choice, and Cliff and Miki disagree with Clara's choice. And are either of them wrong? Like, you could make an argument both ways, right? But fail human, like, and like people trying and failing and getting up and trying again, and doing the best for dying children, again, the best worst possible choice, and like being ripped apart by that choice, but really feeling like they're backed into a corner. And like this whole thing is like, it's about, again, what is humanity? What makes us human? What makes us human to each other? How do we survive,
Yeah.
as humans, and not lose those parts of ourselves? And so to then have it come back around and, yes, have all of these themes be brought together, but then like by this alien, I was like, but why?
Yeah.
So I don't, again, I agree thematically, it does a really good job of bringing it all together. But I potentially find, so there's a coda here at the end. It's not really a chapter. It's why I said like 14 and a half chapters. There's like a brief coda, which is a message from the Yamato, which is the spaceship that Mickey and Yumi are on, after they find their second Earth, and they send a message back. And it is absolutely just like a total flip of the script, right? Because when we think about sci-fi, we think, okay, the people like on the spaceship out in space travel, like they're in the future, right? They're futuristic, they're out there. But there's a recognition in the message that the Yamato sends that they are like 6,000 years now behind the people of Earth. Like they're getting these messages about stasis and VR worlds and all this type of stuff. And they're still working on the technology they left with. And now they're starting from scratch on a
Yep.
new planet, right? And they have to try to figure out how to like recreate the resources they already have, let alone like,
Anything that would have come
and there's
after
a
they
line
left.
and it's like, we've we've discovered a new place for humanity, but we might not have anything in common with you anymore. And
Yeah.
then like that whole question, which is just like, okay, they're all human, right? But like, they probably don't share any of the same customs, cultures,
Sociologically,
technology.
yeah.
Yeah. And I was like, more of that, please. That was far more interesting than Alien Lady.
Yeah.
um,
The thing that like really hit me, and I messaged it to Gretchen when I read it, was that the very last line of the book is, I might wake up early to watch the sunrise, which is such a, like, it's such a human thing of just, it's not even saying I'm gonna go watch the sunrise now. It's, I might wake up early to watch the sunrise.
but I think, and so, but I mean, the thing that follows after that too is he says the retired captain of the Yamato, right? And
Yes.
it's like this moment of like, this is done.
Yeah.
The plague is done. This space travel is done. Like, he now gets the choice to potentially watch the sunrise.
Yeah.
And the choice that was denied to so many people in how they died, where they died, the pain they died in, that they were denied choices for jobs, for to continue living. And now there's like this retired captain who has a choice to watch the sunrise. um, it's a very hopeful way to end it.
It is, but it is also like so simplistic. It like at the very core, it's about
Well, and
choice.
that's why I wanted more of that bit that was before that, of him being like, we may not have much more in common with you anymore. Because
Yeah.
I feel like a final chapter that brings together like all of these themes, right? But also at its core has the tension of like, we did this for you. We did this so that Earth could continue.
He
But
also
like,
says that they haven't received anything in 1,000 years. So there very much is a chance that life on Earth is gone.
Yeah, more of that would have been way more interesting than, and I think continue to leave not on uncertain footing with the book necessarily, but like more realistic tension
Yeah.
of like, you know, you can try and try and try and try and try. Did you do the right thing? Did it work? Do we know? Do we not know? But like the entire point is that like here is a man who now he doesn't know if Earth is all dead, you know, but
Yeah.
like he's gonna get up tomorrow and maybe watch the sunrise, and that is literally all he can do.
Yeah.
I like more expansion on that. Way more interesting than Alien Lady, and I will die on this hill.
If you listened this far, thank you so much for listening to us talk. This is the longest video I think we have ever made. Again, if you have read it and you want to talk to us about it, in the description below, please tell us about that. Next time, I believe we will be having a reading roundtable, where we will be reading a book that was shortlisted for an award this year. So everybody who's coming to that will have a different book, hopefully, where they will talk about the books that they've read that are some of the best of the last year. And then it's going to be 2025, guys. So we're going to do a wrap up of our reading challenge, of which this was one of them. And we're going to talk about our reading challenge for next year as well. So you look forward to that. If you want to follow us on Storygraph, that's also down in the description below. And we will link to a Storygraph reading challenge if you want to join us in our buddy reading challenge. Please do feel free. And look forward to us talking about that.
Thanks for making it this far, guys. Bye.
Bye!